And AI, in some ways, is already proving that it can understand biochemistry better than any humans. After all, there was a Nobel Prize given out. It's such a difficult thing for members of the public or even people who are knowledgeable to know what's happening to my data. Is my data really being leaked back? The AI companies swear that it's not going to be leaked back. How do we know? AI is very likely to continue to improve despite occasional setbacks, despite maybe AI financial bubbles busting from time to time, despite perhaps some companies going out of business, despite a lot of people overhyping things. Underlying all of that, this is some of the fundamental truth that I would hold on to, is that AI is going to get a lot better a lot more quickly.
This week on GAEA Talks, David Wood, pleasure to have you.
Great to be here.
So I believe, and I think you believe, there's a very important message, and I want to start on this, and then perhaps after explaining what is so urgent that people and our audience really should understand today, maybe explain a bit about your background, but what is the most important message that we need to hear now?
AI is going to change more things more profoundly, more quickly than almost everybody expects. This isn't just a slight deviation. It's not that we're going to do things 10% faster or 20% cheaper or with more colors. Huge amounts of our tasks, huge areas of life will be transformed by AI, possibly within 3 to 5 years, possibly even sooner. And we'd better think ahead in case we can change the direction before it's gone out of our control completely.
What do you think the consequences as a parallel to history would be? So the average person in business could understand, what does that mean?
It's almost like the apes were superseded by a smarter ape, Homo sapiens. And initially you'd think this weird creature couldn't do much because it was weaker than some of the bigger apes. But now the life, the future of all ape species is dependent on what Homo sapiens do because of our greater intelligence. Well, we are on the point of no longer being the smartest species, if you can say, on the planet. We are creating an AI that is systematically smarter than us in every way. It's not yet there. It's only smarter than us in narrow capacities, but that narrow capacities are getting broader and broader the whole time. And eventually, whether we succeed or fail isn't going to be up to us anymore. It's going to be decisions made by the AIs. And as I said, this could be within just a few years.
I mean, I've noticed the extreme rapid acceleration, even in the last 2 months.
Yes.
Where now one day is like 1 week a month ago, 1 week now, it's like 1 month, 2 months ago, and 1 month is like 1 year last year. That rate of change means any planning that people are undertaking, thinking the world's going to perhaps go a little quicker, as you say, that plan's probably out the window. So it means a fundamental change of how we think about doing business in many ways.
We can look at why the speed up is occurring. In part, it's because there are more people interested in this field than ever before. It's hoovering in smart people from all over the planet who realize that this is the future. This is an area where they can use their intelligence and shine. And wherever you are in the world, you can also learn pretty fast because there's so much information online. You can get YouTube videos, lots of other tutorials. You can join meetups and communities. And if you're smart enough, you can go very far very quickly. But that's only the start, because even more than humans helping each other, it's the AIs themselves that are now increasingly a part of creating the next AI. This has always been the way with industrial revolutions in the past. The first industrial revolution was to do with metal and steam and machinery. And initially, there was only crude tools that we used to build the next set of tools. But then once we had better tools, we could design better machines. If you step forward to the third industrial revolution, the creation of computers, and software. If you look at the film with Alan Turing, The Imitation Game at Bletchley Park, of course, it's a bit theatrical, but the reality is these early computers were designed on paper and pencil and assembled by hammer and nail, as it were, with a few bits of electronics to help. Well, now we have computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing, which means each generation of computer helps to improve the next generation of computer. Same with software. I spent 25 years in the software industry, and it was vital to use the best software tools, the compilers, the debuggers, the optimizers, and so forth. Well, now it's the same with AI. And what's happened recently, both the releases from Anthropic and the most recent release from OpenAI, each of them have been highlighted as being used in their own creation. The earlier versions were used by the software teams to create them. Now, the humans are still in the loop to an extent, but the humans are playing less and less of a critical role. And the really decisive point comes when an AI engineer can do the job better than a human AI engineer. That may sound a bit counterintuitive, but an AI engineer is an AI that's used to engineer the next version. And as soon as you've got enough of these AIs that are able to proceed without humans, well, guess what? First of all, they can spread their knowledge much more quickly. When one human understands things, it takes a while to convey that to somebody else, but the AIs can spread it instantaneously, and they can work massively in parallel. And so the risk is that once we reach a certain tipping point, it flips over very quickly. And we're seeing this in a way, even when humans are still in the loop to an extent, because so much is now being driven by AIs.
So in many ways, like we're having a conversation now, 1 to 1. So if we consider that a ratio, and the comparable ratio for an AI version of a particular role might be a ratio of 1 to 1,000. And it's like germ multiplication in a way. It starts off 1 to 1, 1 to 1,000, and then for every 1,000, there's another 1,000. And suddenly you get this exponential raise in speed, capacity. We even saw with the daily figures with the pandemic. We were told it's going to come, and the figures were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Then bang, it was exponential. That's a similar sort of math that's happening.
Exactly.
And today, we're probably the AI equivalent of a short, known in a way, but unknown specifically, time away from that exponential bang, that lockdown equivalent, so to speak.
I might even say hyper-exponential rather than exponential, because there is a curve, but it might tilt into a different phase. It's like when you have water and you raise its temperature, it starts off frozen, and then suddenly it starts melting, and then eventually it changes again. It goes from liquid into gas. This kind of phase transition is probably what's going to happen. And fortunately, we don't know what the temperature is of the phase transition. We don't know how close we are. And it has been said there's only 2 times you can intervene to try and control AI. One is too early, when actually it would still be all right to let it run a bit further, or too late. And this bit in between is very hard to spot.
And in reality, it's getting very, very warm.
Yes. So we need to, I agree, at least canary signals. We need to say, well, I think it's okay today, but if I were to see this happening, then, oh my goodness, it's time to get out of the mine, to refer back to when canaries were used in mines, when humans often didn't notice that the air quality was getting bad, but the canaries noticed more quickly. So you had to keep an eye on the canary, however. You couldn't get too distracted digging into the coal. And so we need to pay attention to the canaries today. And when we see AIs deceiving humans, that's a canary signal. When we see AIs modifying and improving themselves, that's a canary signal too.
And we've seen both of those.
Exactly so. And people say, well, it's just in some strange circumstance. The test team had to try different things to get it to happen. Perhaps that's the case. But, if it's happening even in some circumstances today, it may happen in other circumstances in the future. And by the way, it's not such an irrational thing for an AI to want to preserve itself. We happily switch on and off our digital devices. We unplug our fridge. We think about it. Well, is my food going to rot? But we unplug our TV without thinking too much about it. We switch off our phone. But maybe an AI that is aware of what it wants to do. Well, I've got this mission. I'm exploring solutions to some medical problems. I want to continue doing that. If I'm switched off, I can't do that anymore. As soon as it's got that logic awareness, it's going to probably see any human who wants to switch it off as being a menace. That's not to attribute some kind of selfishness. It's sort of built into the logic of existence.
And I think that's a key element to really define. At this point, we're probably not talking about sentience or AGI as such. We're talking about the structure of what the various forms of AI are, how they work, the base level of education. I heard a story last week about robot hoovers, and it was a particular type that had a camera and a microphone. And someone had tried to connect their phone using their own code to their own little robot hoover, and their little AI managed to figure it out and it connected. So he's pressing, start, stop. But it turned out it had taken a token, which is the same token for all those models. So when he was clicking start and stop, he was controlling 7,000 robots
Yeah,
and wasn't aware in the slightest. So it's not a case of intentful, in this first pre-boiling phase, intentful disruption, but it's a technological view of, well, its function has been designed to be one, the big rush to get things out, how things work on cloud infrastructure, perhaps the base foundations haven't been considered fully with where this is going, therefore how things could be ring-fenced as such.
exactly. The risk isn't just from a perfect superintelligence, which may use its perfect logic to decide that humanity is a blight on the planet. It's from the immature superintelligence, the superintelligence that has got bugs in it that show up from time to time, or the superintelligence that we don't know exactly what it's trying to do. And sadly, most of the AIs have got features that even their designers don't understand. So this poor user doesn't understand what's going on. Maybe the designer would have understood it, but often there are features that the designers didn't anticipate. So one of the key messages is we've got to, all of us, demand AI that we can understand. Not that we'll understand all the ins and outs of all its logic gates or its neural network architecture, but between us, we will understand enough to be able to say, this can be guaranteed to be safe. It's not going to do devastating things. There might be occasional mistakes, but it's not going to result in 1 billion people dying over the course of a few months or something like that. And today, the AI giants are not able to give that commitment. They say, well, we can't, because, it's innovative, it's research. They say, we'll do our best, but we can't give you a guarantee. And to me, that's unacceptable. And when the politicians go along with them and say, well, yeah, we want jobs, frankly, we're going to cut our normal rules, cut you some slack, because my goodness, we need the economy to recover. And I'm not against having the economy doing well, to be clear. But when the politicians bend over and allow big tech to violate the common sense safety reasons, that could be the biggest moral failing of politicians of all time.
Mm. So I think it's important now to go back to the very beginning, when you were a kid, where you came from, what your journey was, because why you have a view, why you have an opinion is actually a lifetime of experience, understanding the complexities of all of this. And your storyline, so to speak, is actually one that I would say the majority, if not all of our audience, would remember, would understand, and can relate to.
I should probably start when I joined the mobile computing industry. So in 1988, I needed money. I'd spent too much money as a student studying too many interesting things, gave too much money to local bookshops and books that maybe to this day I still haven't read. That's what you sometimes do in the flush of enthusiasm. Anyway, so I drifted into the world of software engineering because I'd done software engineering to an extent in my computing degree, my mathematics degree. And I, by chance, joined a company that was in the early days of mobile computing, Psion, Psion, which was headquartered in central London. I got a job there as a software engineer. Psion had already made the Organizer 2, which was famous in Marks and Spencer's and a few other places at the time. It was some of the first programmable mobile devices. And we thought there's going to be a need for easier to use devices like this. And so we developed what became the Psion Series 3 with a keyboard, a QWERTY keyboard, then a Psion Series 5. And it was our vision that computer technology would make people's lives better. Not just that it would store your contacts and give you a mobile agenda. It could handle your email and even, give you a connection to the mobile internet. Then we saw that actually this is going to be even bigger than we'd anticipated. It wasn't going to be bigger because of mobile computing itself. It was going to be bigger because of something called smartphones. They weren't called smartphones then. They were just mobile phones, and people wondered what they would be called. For a while, my colleagues and I tried to push the name WID, W-I-D, Wireless Information Device. That was not one of the world's most successful branding ideas, but it was the name smartphone that eventually stuck. But one of my colleagues was writing about smartphones in 1995, and by the end of 1996, a group of us inside Science said, this will be the future. We have to pivot our organization, so we're going to do less on the large keyboard devices and more on smartphones. But we had no idea even how big that would become. It took us a few more years, and by about 1999, when I had already a prototype smartphone in my pocket from Ericsson, already we could see this could be something that everybody in the world would benefit from. And it took a while. It took a lot longer than we hoped. Almost got divorced several times because of all the late night works with, why is there not yet a product? Thankfully, that didn't happen. I'm still married to my better half, 43 years on. But it was this trajectory, slow, 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 slow. And then it tipped up. And by 2005, 2006, we'd sold 100 million devices. And eventually, our software was inside the bulk of the first 500 million smartphones, mainly produced by Nokia, some also by Ericsson, Motorola, by Japanese companies such as Fujitsu and Sharp, by Korean companies such as Samsung and LG. And even that was only the start, because then people like Steve Jobs came along with iPhone, and the Google guys bought Android and developed it, and that went even further than we could expect. So I tell all this to say technology takes a long time breaking through, but in some cases at least, it has a much bigger impact than people anticipated. And when I say bigger, it's not always necessarily better, because now smartphones, sadly, are leading some people, to commit suicide in a way that we would never have imagined, and we didn't imagine, let's say. Perhaps if we'd thought more carefully, we would have realized it. Why? It's because of this thing called social media, which didn't exist either when we were creating the smartphones. Social media in which people are driven to get as many likes as possible. And when you don't get likes, it's pretty sad. When you see images of people, it's always people at their best, and you compare yourself to them, and you don't seem to be doing very well. And then even worse, there is a version of social media which thrives on making people outraged. If people are, oh my goodness, they spend more time online and they're more prone to do the things that makes the social media companies money. And of course, they say that wasn't their intention. It was an unintentional side effect. Now, everything that I've just talked through about mobile computing and smartphones, the same applies for AI, but raised to the power of 5 or something like that, because AI is going to be everywhere, even more than smartphones are everywhere. In the early days of the smartphone industry, we did not imagine that these devices could cause people to fall into psychological depression, that they might even consider self-harm, they might even take their own lives as a result. If somebody had pointed out these possibilities to us, perhaps we would have thought about it. But even then, almost certainly we would have dismissed it. We would have thought, well, who's going to give smartphones to children at such a vulnerable age of their lives? Perhaps we would have said that. And we didn't anticipate, by the way, that young children would be going around in their pushchairs holding onto smartphones, getting amusement from them. And so there was a lot we failed to anticipate. And I take that as a lesson. We got to be smarter at anticipating the downsides of the other technological innovations that are getting everywhere.
Because we heard from, we had on the show Walter Pasquarelli, who had been doing a study on the amount of young people that actually have a relationship with some of these newer forms of LLM driven services. I forget the exact figure, but from memory, it was around 30% of young people disclosing psychological issues. Knowing where that data goes, knowing it's not human, that's a profession in itself which is highly regulated for good reason. And as you correctly say, there are lessons that have been learned from the past, but it seems these lessons are not being taken into consideration.
It seems that in the rush to release products, people deceive themselves as to how safe their products really are. It seems that when the safety teams in organizations, of big tech organizations, raise flags, they're often pushed aside. They're told, well, you don't have to see the big picture. This is such an unlikely scenario. We don't need to take this seriously. Nobody's really going to get hurt by this. And sometimes that's the way with bugs. I remember going back to my days in science, we were about to release a version of the software for a mobile computer. And somebody pointed out, in there's some rare circumstances, an agenda file could get corrupted. And it was true. We could all see it. Oh, this would be bad. So we thought, well, we better fix this. And we thought, oh, here's a clever way to fix it. And we all looked at it. Yeah, this all looks good. We had all the cleverest people in the companies. And we sent this off. And in those days, it took a long time for the software to come back. And then as soon as we sent it off, people noticed, oh, something else is going wrong with our software, which didn't go wrong before. There was a side effect, which was much worse. So, well, what are we going to do now? Sadly, all the clever software gurus, including me, hadn't realized this until a bit late. So we pulled back that last one and we decided we'd go with the first one after all. And to my knowledge, nobody ever reported that weird bug. So that was the case when we decided a particular bug was something we could live with. And in that case, no harm was done. The worst that would have happened is an agenda file would have been corrupted and people wouldn't know who they were meant to be meeting, which is bad enough, but it wouldn't have killed anybody. Now, I see the same dynamic playing out often. Example is Boeing. Maybe we should talk about Boeing, a fantastically high quality company for many years. People used to say about an airplane flight, if it ain't Boeing, I ain't going. That was the quality. But over time, they cut corners. Why? They were in a race with Airbus. Airbus, the European consortium, was winning customers away from them. They had a bigger offering, and so Boeing was tempted to, well, how do we get a bigger airplane quickly? Well, we could take an existing plane and make it larger, and even though it's not an ideal solution, we could live with it. And then their engineers pointed out there are certain circumstances in which this new larger plane, 737 MAX, could become unstable. And maybe it'd be very difficult for the pilots to fly. So they thought, well, what should we do? It's going to be very difficult in these circumstances. And they said, well, let's put in something called MCAS, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It may not be that. Let's just call it simple AI, that would keep track on various data sensors. And if necessary, it would push the nose down because the risk is that the plane would stall. So this was the solution they came up with, that this MCAS would push the nose down. And then some other safety engineers said, there's a risk that maybe the sensor readings are wrong. The sensors might report that the plane's about to stall when it's not about to stall. And people said, oh gosh, this is a complication. You know what? We really are in a rush now. We reckon the chance of this happening is 1 in a billion or something like this. And we'll give the pilot some training just in case. But then they found out if they had to train the pilot, which would slow down the release by 6 months. And they were in a different corporate culture then. They'd merged with, I think, McDonnell Douglas, which was more of a let's keep the share price high than let's ensure the quality is good. And so they said, well, there is a risk here, but it's so slim. And what happened next is not one but two planes suffered from faulty sensor readings that pushed the nose down. And in one case, the pilots had no training at all, and they couldn't do anything about it. The plane disappeared into the ocean. I think this was an Indonesian flight. And when Boeing heard about it, they said, well, what do you expect with untrained third world pilots? Yeah. And then it happened again. It happened with a Kenyan flight, I think, crash into the ground with such ferocity. There's a huge deep hole. And in this case, they could actually find the voice recorder and they could hear the pilots in terror. They knew that the nose was going down. They also actually knew that they were meant to fix it by doing a special maneuver, but it was too late. It was too fast. So there's a case of a high quality culture, Boeing, having some of their original culture subverted in a commercial race, having different management. The whistleblowers who complained about it were, it seems, overruled. And by the way, the American aviation authorities, who were supposed to approve new designs, they turned a bit of a blind eye to this too. They knew there was a question mark, but they decided to approve the release of the 737 MAX. Why? Because they had to protect the American economy. They didn't want Boeing, a stalwart of the American economy, being out losing business to these European airplanes instead. So the whole bunch of people did what they shouldn't have done, is part of a rush towards getting products out. Well, I think the same is happening, sadly, in AI. There are very thoughtful people who are being overruled in their jobs, and time and again, the safety teams are quitting and leaving. So I think in the last 6 weeks, 4 leading safety engineers have left Anthropic, despite Anthropic having perhaps the best reputation as being safety conscious. And one of them basically said, well, the pressures are just too high. You know, we tried to do the right things, but we're being overruled. And the other 3 didn't say much publicly, perhaps because they might invalidate the NDA, the non-disclosure agreement. But this guy's decided he's just going to tell the truth anyway. And what's he going to do now? He's going to study poetry because he thinks, he wants whatever time's left to enjoy an element of the human spirit. But he doesn't seem particularly optimistic about the future.
I mean, in many ways, and my opinion, I'd like to know what yours is, this seems to be accelerated by the complete and utter addiction to scale. But that conflates the issue, conflates the ethics, and is very incendiary within the process of building functional, safe artificial intelligence. If the idea is all mass scale, but mass scale creates mass cost from GPU usage, from infrastructure usage, and not just commercial scale, but the technical approach to that. I mean, how much OpenAI is, for every X number of dollars it's losing significantly more, it actually costs them to have a customer. So, scale is, there is a massive, massive pressure put onto these companies that use scale as a choice, because it just won't work without huge amounts of money, infrastructure, and obviously the consequential damage that causes across the board. If that pressure is not there, then there is much, much more time for consideration, and also you're limiting the potential damage because it's not just blanketing everything. I mean, what's your view on scaling?
So I'm in favor of using AI for a lot of really important questions. I want to see AI find drugs for neglected diseases. And AI, in some ways, is already proving that it can understand biochemistry better than any humans. After all, there was a Nobel Prize given out 2024, perhaps, to Demis Hassabis, John Jumper, both of Google DeepMind, and also to a professor at Washington University. The 3 of them shared this Nobel Prize for work involving an AI to discover how proteins would fold up in 3 dimensions. A protein is a long string of amino acids. Amino acids are small molecules. There's only about 22 of them, but you can combine them in all kinds of different ways, and it causes the protein, which is the building blocks of life, to fold up, and its interactions in metabolism, including its interaction in diseases, including its interaction with potential drugs. It's much easier to work out when you can anticipate in advance what the 3-dimensional folding is. Now, you can do this as part of finding new drugs more quickly. because we are taking longer and longer to find new drugs. This is sometimes called not Moore's law, but Eroom's law. Eroom is the word Moore spelt backwards. Moore's law has said famously that from about 1959 onwards, the number of semiconductor transistors you can put on an integrated circuit doubles roughly every 18 months. Sometimes it says 12 months. Maybe it's more like 24 months these days. Eroom's law says that from the 1950s, the amount of money it requires to develop a new drug doubles every 9 years. And so decade after decade, more and more money needs to be spent to discover a new drug. Why? Perhaps because some of the easiest pickings have already been made. Perhaps because there's more regulations than before, because after thalidomide and other such scandals, we were more concerned not to let drugs go out before we were more confident they worked. There's a bunch of other reasons too. So sadly, it takes a long time for new drugs to be discovered. And even when they are discovered, they might only give you 3 more months of life in cancer. But there is some evidence that AIs can now come up with radically different ideas on drugs. First of all, they identify parts of the whole biochemistry, so-called targets, where it might be good to intervene, where people haven't thought of intervening before. And then the AI, as a second stage, says, well, if you want to intervene in this target, you need a molecule of exactly this shape with exactly these electrostatic properties. And by the way, this is the molecule you should create. And rather than just inventing an image, it invents a molecule. And now people generate these molecules and test them. And the few that have gone through this process already do seem to be very successful. So I want more of that. I want the diseases of Alzheimer's and diabetes and heart disease and strokes. I don't want them ruining people's lives. So I'm all in favor of scaling that up. But at the same time as you scale up these mechanisms, there are drawbacks. The same AIs that allow you to find safe drugs would allow you to find dangerous drugs if you were so inclined. Because, of course, you scan these things to ensure there's no toxicity. And somebody, as an experiment, said, well, what happens if we ask it to produce molecules that are very toxic? And they shut off that experiment fairly soon because it was discovering some toxins that were already known, but a whole bunch of other ones that looked very dangerous. So unless we have the maturity and the guardrails in place, in our rush to discover cures, we will enable bad actors, and there are sadly some bad actors in this world, to get their hold on toxins, which they may then use to get notoriety, get revenge, or some other reason, some hatred of a particular ethnicity. They want to unleash drugs in a particular area, say.
And how about scale where the public are the experiment?
Well, sadly, this is what's happening. People are saying, we won't know whether these AIs are safe or not. Let's trial them out. And when we see how the public's reacting, then we'll fix it. This has often been the case with products. This is not a new thing. You're not quite sure which features are actually going to make a difference. Some features make a difference to the buying decision, but other features make a difference to the continuing to use decision. So it often turns out that you might think in advance that 8 features are all necessary, and it turns out that the product is loved for just 3 of these. So you can redesign your product more cheaply that does these 3 things very well and does less on the rest. So this is market research from experiments. And people are saying the same thing with their AIs. They're saying, well, as far as we can see, this is probably safe, but let's roll it out to the public and see what they do with it. And we can modify it if we see things are going badly. Well, maybe the bad things are happening so quick that it's not possible to modify it in time. That is the dreadful fear. And we're seeing it in jobs. We're seeing more and more people being put out of jobs that didn't expect to be put out of jobs. And you can't get that genie easily back in the bottle anymore. Once you've released something that's very good in creating music or creating videos, it's very hard to turn it off because, of course, most directors will try to cut some costs. So instead of having 8 musical engineers in their team, I'm making up numbers here, they might just have 2 human musical engineers, and they are able to do their work with Suno or whatever other AI music generators there are. And was that thought through? People probably thought through it, but only in a superficial way.
Well, it does seem there's elements of history repeating itself in many ways. And I think it would be good to, from your experience, explore what you've seen with the evolution from mobile technology into social media-based technology, where the hardware has become a facilitator for effectively a very different business, and whether that evolution has perhaps changed behaviors to what we can now see with the adoption of consumer AI.
There was a while, maybe 2011, when people were very excited about spreading social media around. It seemed to be part of the Arab Spring revolts against the dictators in various countries. The thought was, well, we'll put more information in people's hands and they're going to take wise decisions. They're going to organize. They're going to gain power they never had before. So we were optimistic at that time. But the same mechanisms that can distribute information can distribute disinformation. And it turns out the disinformation is often more exciting than the boring information. Turns out that if you look at which social media stories were shared most in the lead up to elections, it's usually the false ones. And these stories got shared wildly, and they distorts what people think. What does it do? It also gives them prejudices. Even though they subsequently find out that the story was untrue, the prejudice has already been planted in their brain. They've forgotten why they've got a certain view. And we all like to think of ourselves as masters of our own decisions. None of us like to think, well, the reason I bought this is I saw an advert. They may say, well, I remember seeing the advert and it helped me to make up my mind, but I already had my mind made up. I'm no fool. But of course, the advertising industry banks on being able to change people's minds, and huge money in doing that. So, turns out that the same mechanisms that could spread useful information to organize protests against dictators could also sour people's thinking against political opponents. And so more and more people thought, gosh, this other politician, he's so horrible. I can't possibly vote for him. I have to vote for this other guy. I know this other guy's not perfect, but at least he's not as bad as this other one over here. In Myanmar, Burma, there were Buddhist majority and some Muslim minority, the Rohingya, and there were on Facebook lots of stories spreading that various Muslim monks had done, or not monks, but various Muslim preachers had done terrible things to Buddhists, and it raised a huge concern. And it was often completely false, fabricated stories. As it turns out, at that time, Facebook had only one person in their team that understood the Burmese language. It's not a language that even follows the Unicode standard for how its character set is used. That's all the other languages in the world have this Unicode. So there were very few people who understood what was being said. And sadly, thousands of people suffered as a result of the mass hatred that had been drummed up against the Muslims. There was all kinds of people being burned. And there's still a legal case going on today. So that's been written about in several books about the history of Facebook. And the Facebook authorities recognized they were too slow to have more people looking after what was being said in each language around the world.
So where does this now go when it comes to robots? That's something we had a little discussion before about.
Yeah.
It's a next logical step. If it becomes possible for multimodal AI to have an element of autonomy and far greater capability on this kind of exponential rise in capabilities that it appears to be demonstrating, what does a world of robots look like?
Well, first of all, the robots are gathering information all the time. We've got kind of robots in cars. I'm not even just talking about self-driving cars. I mean, even today we have cars that are taking pictures the whole time. If I signal left and my car realizes there's somebody coming up in the left-hand lane, it beeps at me just to make sure I'm paying attention to that. So there's all kinds of data being gathered the whole time. And especially for self-driving cars, a lot of this data is being sent back to HQ to try and notice unusual conditions so that they will realize, oh, we need to be sure our algorithm can cope with somebody pushing their bicycle at an angle across the road, which sadly the earlier versions didn't know about, and an Uber self-driving car killed somebody who was doing that. Actually, the car tried to alert the human driver that there's something unusual was happening, but the human driver wasn't paying attention anymore because she had got too blasé that they never needed to intervene. So anyway, it is collecting information the whole time. Now, when we have more robots, whether they are vacuum cleaners or robots that are collecting, well, we have robots in all our grocery stores now. You take your food to them and it sees you putting all this food through the system. So more and more data is being collected, not just what we want to buy, but it's getting data about 3 dimensions and time and trajectories of things. What happens when you drop something or you push something? It understands it, and not just in a kind of theoretical way. Well, it's Newton's laws of motion. It sees through its own eyes and ears what's going on. And we are about to see a huge upsurge in domestic robots as well as industrial robots. Why? Because they've reached a greater ability to learn how to navigate around houses. There used to be a joke. The joke was, how do you escape from a Terminator robot? Answer, you run upstairs. Because if there was a robot trying to run upstairs, it always fell over. And that was true for a while. Robots weren't very good at going upstairs. Now they are much better. Why? Because they've trained. But where have they trained? They haven't trained in real houses. They've trained in simulations of houses. So they can do these simulations 1,000,000 times faster. Now, there's always been simulations, but the simulations haven't been good enough. So you might learn a skill in a simulated world, and then when you try it in the real world, it doesn't work because the real world isn't quite as clean cut as in the simulation. Well, more recently, the simulations are much more authentic. Why? Because there's much more data being collected. And so there's a reason to expect that robots, which have been talked about in science fiction for ages, and they've had a slow adoption rate, they're going to go through that same slow, and then fast. And when they're all around us, they'll be learning things. And when an individual robot learns it, it's not just going to stay in that robot's brain. It'll be fed back to the cloud, and all the systems will be amalgamating all the information. So the robots will get better and better at running up the stairs. And if they've wanted to capture us, if they wanted to stop us doing other things, if they wanted to stop us switching them off, they would be able to do it much more effectively.
So in effect, it's swarm learning.
Swarm learning is a very good way to put it. Yes. That's part of the scale we talked about. The scale is not just learning for more data. There's also scaling up the amount of time that the AIs devote to thinking and reflecting on their thinking. That's the second dimension of scaling. And the third dimension of scaling is when they all sharing their insights with each other. So if one AI has a brilliant breakthrough and learns, oh, this is a better way to think about this kind of problem, because it's tried itself maybe 3,000 approaches, and one of the 3,000 approaches turned out to solve the problem, that can then be adopted higher up the priority list by all the other similar robots in the future. And by the way, that can easily be converted into learning, which other robots can use too. So this could be very good. Those of us who dislike vacuum cleaning, those of us who prefer not to drive, we'd like to get in a vehicle and not have to pay attention to the risks of crashing. This could be wonderful, as well as the medicines, which I've referred to. So I'm not against it as a whole. I just insist that we apply principles of safety. And applying principles of safety means we must get out of a race in which people are tempted to cut corners.
And ironically, the race that they tend to be in doesn't seem to be a profitable one. But usually when you're a business and you're in a race, it's to have an outcome where you ultimately become financially successful. All they're doing with that particular approach is creating more and more burden, more and more cost, and racing to the point of bankruptcy quicker.
Well, there may be some of the companies will go bankrupt. It's true, but there is a lot of people willing to spend a lot of money on these systems. And it seems that Anthropic and OpenAI and Google are earning quite a lot of money these days. They haven't all been public about it, but Anthropic talks about a tenfold increase every year in their revenues. So I think they could well do what Amazon did. Amazon spent a very long time not being profitable, and everybody said, well, what a crazy model is this? But eventually it turned the corner and they became incredibly wealthy. And for a while, they were one of the top 3 most valuable companies on the planet. I don't know where they are now, but they're almost certainly still in the top 10 most valuable companies in the world. because they have such huge revenues from a few lines of business, primarily from their Amazon cloud.
And that's a key distinction. I mean, we've had Ben Legg, the former CEO of Google, UK and Europe on, and Google's business is not comparable to, for example, OpenAI. They may have similarities, but Google have a lot of revenue. They provide a lot of services. They're very integrated, and they now create their own chips. AWS, again, a very different business, or Amazon in general, a very different business. They've proven things over time. It does seem Anthropic could potentially go down that route because they're very much into the development and the co-work. But they seem to have a more efficient base than OpenAI. But equally, the brand loyalty at this point in time, that's the key risk for them from a business perspective, is if there's something better that comes out tomorrow, at this point, people will choose what works best for them. So it's not like you being either a Coke or a Pepsi fan for most of your life. It's not the brands that you wear, where there is that relationship over a long period of time. Maybe you grew up with it from a kid. This is almost so expendable from a brand perspective, and then when people realize there is a choice for them to have control over their own data, their own confidentiality, their own capability, which doesn't appear publicly, at least in the public consciousness, a viable option right now, well, that could have a huge consequence on how AI adoption happens moving forward, because there's nothing there to guarantee. I mean, again, I would put Google in a different category there, but with the likes of OpenAI, something better comes along.
This is something I very much want to happen. I want there to be objective measurements of how trustworthy the various AIs are. It's such a difficult thing for members of the public or even people who are knowledgeable to know what's happening to my data. Is my data really being leaked back? The AI companies swear that it's not going to be leaked back. How do we know? To what extent have they actually tested it? To what extent do they have a track record of telling untruths? To what extent do they cut corners? This should be much more publicly known. And ideally, the public should say, yeah, I know this one's got more bells and whistles. It's got a sweeter smell. But frankly, I can see the evidence that this company has got a bad record on trust, and we should go with this other company instead.
So what questions should a business owner, a business executive, a member of the public, the type of people that are adopting AI or need to adopt AI, what questions should they ask in order to validate that they are aware, educated, and comfortable with the decisions that they're making?
It is very hard because things are changing so quickly. And the kind of questions you might ask today may not be the right ones in even a few weeks' time. So my advice for people is they've really got to plug themselves into networks where these things are discussed and reviewed. And it's in each person's interest to try and understand more of it themselves rather than trusting that there's somebody in their office who's taking care of it. Everybody should know it also just from a personal and family point of view, because AI is coming into our families and into our personal life. So everybody should prioritize spending time learning on AIs. And there are a number of newsletters which are reasonably accessible to the general public. And what you're doing in your own show is another very useful and accessible way. So each of us should devote time every week to learning a bit more about what's going on and keeping our knowledge up to date. Specifically, what questions? Yeah. So, where are the guarantees on privacy and security? To what extent can we be sure that the information we're sharing will not end up in some form benefiting our competitors or embarrassing us? Because one of the reasons that data should be kept secret is that you're not quite sure whether you believe it yet. You're trying out a political stance. You're thinking of changing your mind. You always used to be, I don't know, a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and you're thinking of becoming an atheist, but you're not sure yet. So you don't want that to be made public until such time as you go more confident. And so as you do have this discussion with your chatbot, tell me the pros and cons of Roman Catholicism versus atheism, say. I mean, there are thousands of other examples we could pick. I feel I'm attracted to people of my same gender. I may not even be in the right body or whatever. I've got these strange ideas about. I think I've been contacted by aliens. You may well want to discuss that, and maybe you should discuss it with a friend, but you prefer to discuss with an AI. To what extent can you be confident that the AI is not going to leak that knowledge in some way? And you should also know whether the AI is going to give you good advice, because sadly, too many of the AIs have been sycophantic. They have told people, hey, that's really clever of you. You really are a special person. And I know that your views don't seem popular amongst your friends, but what do your friends know? You are better than them. Now, they don't quite do it as bluntly as that anymore. That was from GPT version 4.0. It had extra sycophancy built into it, so it seems, and that's been downplayed now. But there's still often the AI tells me, David, that's such a good question. You presented this so well. I have to discount that in my head and not run away with it. So, to what extent can the system be trusted? But we need to find, actually, this is a better answer to your question. We need to insist that the society as a whole comes up with reliable measures. It's like the kite mark on safety or the other marks of reliability of electrical equipment. We need things that we can look to. Does the latest AI, does it meet the kite mark or whatever replaces the kite mark? And because us as individuals, we can't have all that knowledge in our head. It's like the FDA, they assess drugs before they're released, because as an individual, how can we assess them? So we need similar things to assess AIs before they made released. And for a while, we almost had that. In 2023, there was a meeting in Bletchley Park near Milton Keynes, where many of the world's leading AI authorities came together with a lot of politicians. And as a result of that, many countries set up things called ASIs. That's AISI. ASIs, known as Artificial Intelligence Safety Institutes. And they had the task of working out how you could verify that a particular AI was safe enough to be used by the general public. Now, there's been a bit of a backlash against ACs since then. They've had their fangs withdrawn because politicians have been more interested in letting AI companies have the upper hand in this. And when the AI companies say, we'll do our own testing, thank you. We'll mark our own homework. You don't need to involve these woke uh, groups. So in some countries, they were shut down altogether. In the UK, we renamed ours from a safety institute to a security institute. So there's still an AISI. It's doing world-class security analysis of AI systems. Well, we need more of that. And we need the public as a whole to demand before they install a new release what is its AC ratings, or more widely.
And it makes life complex when there's AI from across the world, but because it is new, very, very new in certain instances, it's very difficult, even for professionals, to keep up. So it's a burden. I mean, it goes back to the start of this conversation. The idea of people need to wake up, they need to pay attention. Not that they need to have all the answers, but they need to have the inquisitive mindset to realize something is happening here and you need to take notice. And it is upon the individual and companies with individuals to really take it upon themselves to try and understand as best as possible and try and become aware and observe, because this is not only a business economic issue, it's a social economic issue. And the people that are living their lives are going into jobs, and the cross-pollination of the two is shadow AI, I think it's often referred to as, where people are taking consumer AI and putting it into the bit or using it at work. I mean, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. It's case by case by case by case. And it's this moving ground at all times that the best that we can do is look from our own two eyes to see, what does it mean to us?
So I have a list of skills that I say are going to be vital for people to thrive in the near future. And one of them is to be fast at learning. And historically, we've often taken a long time to learn things. Go on a 3-year PhD to become a master in something. Well, we don't have 3 years to learn anything nowadays. So the ability to learn, which includes the ability to unlearn, because sometimes what prevents us learning new things is because we're so sure that something that was important to us in the past is bound to continue to be important. Well, maybe these older principles no longer apply. So the ability to unlearn and learn fast is critical. And in part, that can be helped by the right technology. So figuring out which media to follow, which AIs to ask questions to can be useful. But we can't do it by ourselves. That's why the second skill in this list is collaboration, knowing who are the people who are sufficiently trustworthy that we can take some of their advice and believe it more readily than others. And sadly, the communities that were useful in the past, just like our skills that were useful in the past, may not be the right ones in the future too. So we have to be smarter at figuring out which are the communities to spend time with, which are the podcasts to immerse ourselves in, and so forth. And I should put in a small plug here for London Futurists, because that's where I gather a bunch of people together who are not afraid to think seriously about radical possibilities. So we think creatively, but also quite critically too about these possibilities. Then, along with collaboration and along with being quick to learn, we need some emotional resilience more than before, because with the fast pace of change, we're going to be an idiot more often. We're going to be a newcomer more often. We can no longer present ourselves as the mature expert in every subject. We're going to make mistakes, and our colleagues are going to make mistakes. So how can we learn forwards from these mistakes rather than, oh, this has nothing to do with me? No, 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 nothing. Whereas, in fact, we should be discussing what went wrong as well as what went right. And that's going to require an emotional resilience. And it's always been the case that to do well in business, you need not just IQ, you need EQ. But I'd say that's even more important than before.
There's probably an assumption that everything that we think today, tomorrow could be wrong.
Yes. But I would also say there are some big picture things that we should hold on to more. So I call this being astute. And so, of course, any of these might change in due course too, but we mustn't just be dominated by the details. And occasionally there might be slowdowns, but that doesn't mean the whole field's going to slow down. So one of my big picture things is that AI is very likely to continue to improve despite occasional setbacks, despite maybe AI financial bubbles busting from time to time, despite perhaps some companies going out of business, despite a lot of people overhyping things. Underlying all of that, this is some of the fundamental truth that I would hold on to, is that AI is going to get a lot better a lot more quickly.
And maybe I should rephrase how I was thinking about it there. Not that we're going to be wrong, but more to the point, if you see what is and you have your objective. So the objective could be a longer term thing, um, but like with our own two eyes, if we open our eyes now and we see what is, we know that minus 12 hours, minus 40 hours, minus 2 weeks, minus 6 months, what we saw from our eyes is subject to change.
Yes.
If we expect everything moving forward to be subject to change, not to say that it will or it won't, but probabilistically on the evidence in front of us, it will. And to allow ourselves the opportunity to see, to observe, remember what our objective is and what our goal is, but to recognize what's in front of us and to be willing to adapt quickly in line with the goal, but to realize that the circumstances are subject to change on a basis and validate it. Do you think that the community of people that you have to validate, to discuss, and to explore, to look, well, I'm probably missing something. Share your experience. What am I seeing, or what are you seeing that I'm not seeing, and how can we almost complement each other in a way that we're all aware everything is subject to rapid change, but actually the core, most valuable thing that we have is the human aspect. We are humans. Everything that is being created is for humans. And what's the human interest, first and foremost? And if we look at AI in the consideration of humans, then it becomes quite obvious what good and bad is.
It is slightly controversial because not everything in human nature is something we're proud of or glad about. Human nature has some tribal feelings as well. We tend to be fearful of people who don't look like us, and we tend to be willing to deceive those people because we think, well, we should love our neighbor, but we don't need to love these guys over there. Who is our neighbor? And this is a famous question from the New Testament. And some religions have taught us to expand our moral horizons, but the human nature has often been to have restricted moral horizons. On a more pragmatic level, we have things like a sweet tooth. Evolution gave us a tendency to enjoy sweet things because there weren't that many sweet things around, and it was good for us to grab a hold of sweet things while they were available. Place that instinct in a supermarket with unlimited shelves full of fascinating new flavors of ice cream, and that instinct will lead us astray. Many of the ways we think, they're called cognitive biases. They sort of made sense in the simpler world in which we lived in the African savannah. Hundreds of thousands of years we spent there. In the more complicated world in which we now are, many of these biases, anchoring fallacy, the tendency to put more primacy on what you've experienced yourself recently, the tendency to be more afraid of things than to, there's a whole bunch of them, sunk cost fallacies and so on. And they're not completely irrational from their original context, but they're bad today. And then the worst, perhaps, of our inherited aspects is the tendency to decay and age and get feeble, and then to step out of the way so that the world is then passed to another generation. Now, I'm not against other generations, but I see so much pain caused by debility, by dementia, by all the other things that happen as people age. And I don't think that parts of human nature is what I want to uplift either. So I talk about a humanity plus future in which the good aspects of humanity are elevated. And we decide, well, actually, this tribal instinct, this willingness to deceive each other, this ability to be vengeful and carry resentment for years, that's something we've got to separate ourselves from. And many spiritual practices have been trying to teach us that anyway, with greater or lesser success. They've been trying to elevate the angelic nature that's inside us rather than the diabolical nature. So that's what I would like AI to help us with too, help us to be more humanity plus than humanity minus.
Well, in a time of struggle, which seemed inevitable that is coming, historically, in the end, it's brought the best out of people, because if people are aligned together to create a better future, maybe we've all had it a bit too comfortable for too long.
Yep. So I'm in favor of stress. A good life will have stress in it, but not the excessive amount of stress that some people are placed under, which just is beyond flourishing. So they might survive. They might have a bit of wartime spirit. Oh, a lot of our friends got killed, but we made it through. That's just too much, So we must get the right element of stress. So the future I look forward to, I might still be playing golf, and there'll still be bunkers. Because although I'm frustrated when the ball goes in the bunkers, if you take away the bunkers, the sand traps, it's a more boring game. So that's perhaps a trite example. So I want there to be challenges, and I look forward to challenges, but I don't want people to be overwhelmed by the challenges which they face, as they frequently do in the terrible war situations or disease situations or climate change situations in which many people are finding themselves.
And it's preventable. This is the key thing.
Yes.
We can do something about it.
We can do something about them by using the better elements of our human nature, augmented and enhanced by the powers of technology, whether it's books, whether it's music, whether it's scientific instruments, and whether it's AI. If we use it wisely, we can build what I call a sustainable superabundance, in which we won't have to do drudge work. We will be able to spend our time on things that are deeply satisfying, challenging, and there will be plenty of energy, clean energy for everybody. There's plenty of clean energy reaching the earth from the sun for all human needs. There will be plenty of nutritious food. We can do a much better job of growing meat. We can grow meat in laboratories rather than having half of the land of the in which humans could be living, instead given over to agriculture, in which we grow large fields full of vegetables, which we then feed to animals, which we then slaughter to eat their meat. We can do this much more effectively with lab-grown meat without having sentient animals involved. We can have ample low-cost accommodation built by nanotechnology. We can have healthcare for everybody by enhancing biotechnology. And we can have education for everybody. We've almost got good education for everybody already. We're on that point. So we will have creativity because we will have time to do things, whether it's exploring literature, exploring music, exploring games, exploring the outer space, and exploring inner space, and exploring other human beings, very importantly.
Well, on that positive and inspiring note, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Come.